Hi, yes, I'm Mike Ascenti. I'm a senior technologist at Dolby Labs. My involvement in the web side of things has been fairly recent. I've joined the Web Audio Group within the last 6 months or so. But I've been at Dolby for 8 years now, doing various things with audio in the broadcast and online space. I am going to come at this at a slightly different angle, as Olivier says, and offer some perspective on audio content creation for linear VR, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a moment, and the importance of objects, and then I'm sure we can get into a discussion about objects a bit later on. So, I don't know if you can see that. I borrowed this presentation from somebody else, so apologies with lack of contrast. When we think about VR at Dolby, we divide it immediately into two categories of interactive and linear. Within linear, we're talking about curated experiences, whether it's a storytelling or cinematic experience, so a movie that you experience through VR. I'm not talking about a VR environment with a screen, but where you are in the movie. Or whether it's an experience like a sports event or a live concert, which could either be actually live at the point where you are viewing it, or it could be post-produced. So where I'm coming at for most of this presentation is talking about those three aspects of linear, so cinematic storytelling, live content, and post-produced experiences. And we've talked a little bit about sound fields or ambisonics and objects. The way that I think about these is a sound field is a description of the sound at a particular point in space. So you can recreate that on the best environment that you have available to you with numbers of speakers or with headphones, and you can rotate around that, but it's a description of everything hitting that point. So in that respect, it is packaged, it is final, there's not a lot you can do with it to modify it. Whereas an object-based representation is really a recipe. It's ingredients and instructions. So objects are simply PCM channels, and they're just channels until you add metadata describing them, whether that's XYZ positions or additional things that I'll get into that allow you to do some fun and interesting things with it. And in terms of capturing those, you can directly capture a sound field and store it straight to ambisonics and do absolutely nothing more with it. It's there, it's very, very easy to do, and it's a very common technique for recording audio, not just for the VR environment. You can do it with a simple tetrahedral capsule or one of these funny silicone ear representations that capture a binaural representation. And that's very, very helpful. With objects, you really need to go through a more traditional content creation workflow with stems and mixing and create a full artistic mix. It's potentially rather more onerous, but also, for obvious reasons, infinitely more flexible. So if we think about a cinematic scene that you might want to recreate in VR, so the famous, you might not be able to see this, but the famous diner scene from Pulp Fiction. So imagine you're sitting in one of the booths when the heist is taking place. Now, if you were to try and capture this purely with a sound-filled mic, you'd immediately run into problems of the fact that you've got people in different places. So it's hard to see, but we've got Jules here very, very close to where the listener is shouting at Vince, who's all the way in the back there, pointing a gun at Yolanda, I think her name was, and then Ringo up the front, speaking more quietly. So with the combination of distance and with different speaking volumes, you can see how that'd be a very, very uneven mix. Now, it might be an approximation of reality, but one of the things that we have learned through our work with the content creation industry is that reality is not actually what you want with virtual reality. You want an artistic experience, and that requires being able to make changes. You'll also get any noise that's happening behind the camera, any shuffling in seats, any clink of spoons against cups, and that will be much, much more prevalent and apparent to you than actually the action going on in front of you, which is what you want the attention to be on. Then when it comes to live events, something like a courtside seat for a basketball game is one of my favorite use cases for VR. I think it would be an absolutely fantastic experience. Again, if you were to use a simple sound field capture technique, when the action comes past you, you'll get a swell in the noise, and then it'll drop off immediately. You won't hear the things that you're used to with the basketball experience, the sound of the ball hitting the backboard, the squeak of the trainers unless they're right in front of you. All that stuff will be sort of lost, and the person eating popcorn next to you will be very, very apparent. The way that you can go beyond this, and the way that you would want to capture this in a real televisual experience, whether for VR or not, is with the introduction of multiple spot mics, as well as room mics, as well as sound field mics at different points on the court, whether that's the mics behind the backboard, the mics, occasionally players will be mic'd up, and at different points in the stadium, crowd noise, so on and so forth, going to a mixer who is then controlling that. Now, even in a live experience for traditional television today, stereo or 5.1, that can be quite a hard job riding faders. Now, once you introduce the VR aspect to that, and potentially different views, you get a massive increase in complexity. There are companies, including Dolby, who are looking at ways to simplify that. But more mics essentially give you more artistic choices. They allow the experience to be smoother. If you imagine switching from one view to another, if you're just with a sound field representation, it's going to be quite a jarring effect. You also would struggle perhaps to add things like narration, commentary rather, over the top of that. In the previous example, there's no film score in this particular scene, but if you want to add a film score, all of those things become simpler with an object-based technique for content creation. And in this instance, I mean, there really is no actual real representation of a live music show that you'd probably want to capture with a sound field mic. What you want, and this is a real VR capture that Jaunt did in partnership with Dolby of Paul McCartney. You can see the camera over there to the right of the piano. Now, a microphone there is not actually going to capture anything from Paul McCartney because you can't hear him. And all of the rest of the noise from the monitor speakers, from the crowd is going to completely drown it out. What you want, again, is somebody actually curating that mix and deciding where in 3D space those particular objects need to go. I don't expect you to digest this slide, but it's in there for your future reference. But what we're essentially saying here is we've got lots and lots of different sources of sound, including, I might add, sound fields. They really are important, but not on their own, which are then going through with additions and mixing and so on and so forth to become channels and objects. So again, a channel is a piece of PCM that might be limited in time or it might be consistent with a set of metadata describing that object, at the very least an XYZ position in space. That then goes through and is monitored at various different stages in various different formats. So it might be monitored on headphones, it might be monitored with a full 3D speaker setup, it might be monitored for stereo, for downmix or 5.1 for instance. Might be monitored in ambisonics, and then that can be stored, in the case of an offline piece of content, as a print master with all that full information, and then rendered out to, it says Dolby Atmos up there, but it could be any bitstream format capable of carrying objects and metadata, or rendered down to an ambisonic mix or another lower order mix. Because at this point, even though we've used objects for content creation, we could still render down to a sound field. If you say, okay, well, I've done my creation now, I've done my artistic bit, I know what the fixed experience should be, we can render that down to a sound field, and that has a lot of advantages for delivery, some of which have been described by Hongchan. It's a lot easier than some of the other object-based techniques, but you still do lose flexibility further down the pipe. I'll explain why that is with Magritte. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right at all. Again, this is somebody else's slides, I apologize. We talked about the difference between reality and virtual reality, and that artistic input being crucial to the experience. And The Hobbit was a great example of where they made it too real and it didn't quite work with the 48 frames per second movie. And the artistic input goes much deeper than the mix. If you imagine in the VR space, as well as the XYZ position of an object, how you render that for distance is not just a matter of attenuation. In fact, what we've discovered with working with sound mixers is they do not want us to automatically attenuate an object or a sound source based on distance, based on some algorithm that they have no control over. They want to be able to set that level for a balanced mix themselves. What they expect for that to be rendered over a full speaker rig is that it will sound exactly like it sounded for them. Now, when you add headphones into the mix, the way that you can quite easily get the effective distance is by adding reverb, adding a room response. And you need metadata to be able to describe whether that object or a given object should be given, say, a far representation or a near representation, or perhaps no spatialization at all. Because, of course, one of the downsides of HRTFs and the way that binauralization traditionally works is that it does actually color the sound as it's trying to represent what the ear and the head does to the sound. Now, that can have a positive effect in terms of being able to spatialize, but it can have a very negative effect in terms of the colorization as well. It's particularly noticeable with music. It smears things, transients become very muddy. So you may want, on an object-by-object basis, to decide, I want this one rendered near, I want this one rendered far, or I want this one stereo panned, don't do any spatialization. You can also do head-tracked versus non-head-tracked objects. So if you think of a commentator for a piece of sport, maybe you want the action to be moving around in a full way, but the commentator, it makes no sense to have him moved in a head-track way. He's just going to sit in the middle of your head. So again, on an object-by-object basis, you can make that choice. You can also do gaze-based activation. So again, the use case is somebody in the crowd sitting next to you at the basketball game. Maybe that's fine. Maybe you want a bit of that, but you don't want it to be overpowering the mix unless you turn to look at it. Then you can set some rules that say, all right, when I'm looking at it, when it's within my field of vision, then we'll increase the level. I'm running out of time and I'm halfway through, so I'm going to speed up. The way that we create some of this metadata, the way that we've approached it is with a plugin into Pro Tools, which is the most common DAW for professional audio content creation. This is the Soundstage 10 at Warner Brothers. This is the Dolby Atmos panner, and you can use this for VR as well and add those pieces of metadata. Other ways you might wish to do it in a live event space, you may want to do some automated panning. If you have an object attached to this fellow's mic, then you can do some tracking of where he is on the stage and automatically pan that appropriately. Or maybe you can do mixing of VR in VR. Actually, this is something that one of our teams put together internally, and it's incredibly useful. This little box on the right-hand side is the virtual space, and you hear it in the space all around you. And actually, when you take that beyond that, this is a very dull photograph to explain that you don't necessarily want VR just through headphones. It might well be a very useful thing to have it through speakers. It removes the problem of isolation and it gives you a shared experience. You might lose some spatial precision, but what you gain in a shared experience might well be worth that. So how this fits into the web, which I probably should have spent more time on given the audience. If we remember where we are, at this point, let's say we want an object mix, and we want an object mix to be rendered and created actually in the browser. We've got a bit stream coming out the end. Again, ignore the fact that says Dolby Atmos, could be anything, could be MPEG-H, could be Opus, could be whatever is capable of carrying this stuff. There are two components that we need in order to actually play this back. We need to initially decode the content in order to spit out the raw audio objects, the channels, the PCM, and the metadata that then goes with them. So those would be buffers with time-synchronized metadata. We then pass those into a renderer. We also pass in the orientation and possibly the position of the viewer, of the listener, and the playback configuration, by which I mean, is it headphones, is it stereo speakers, is it 5.1 speakers, is it whatever, maybe just headphone for now. The renderer then does all the hard graft and spits out audio at the end. Now we've got a couple of options for how we might be able to achieve this within the web audio space, within the web space. If we think at the top of the screen here, we've got things happening in JavaScript and then native on the bottom half. By native, could be in the browser, could be in the OS, whatever. Today we'll be passing the bitstream down into the decoder. The decoder and the renderer could be tightly coupled together. This is the model we have right now for our products. The passing in between is completely hidden from the developer. All you need to do is pass down the orientation and the position, and everything comes out at the end fine. Now, the reason orientation and position is in red today is that there is no way to pass down that information into the decoder at either end. There's no way to do it from the browser, and our decoders, I'm not aware of any other decoders, cannot accept that. I think it would be a good thing to have a standardized interface for being able to pass that information. The other option, of course, is doing the rendering in the Web Audio API, in which case the renderer moves out. Now, what we mean by a renderer at this point is, for example, what Hongchan described. It could be a series of panner nodes, a series of convolver nodes to add reverb, maybe some other things as well, other nodes that take advantage of the other types of metadata that I described to you. By doing it this way, you get the full flexibility of being able to create whatever you want in the browser, but it might be a bit heavy from a complexity standpoint, and you'll get inconsistencies between different browsers in the way they implement, and between different apps in the way that they create the renderer, which means from a content creation standpoint, the mix that you have curated might not be what's being heard at the end, and that is something that generally creatives are not keen on. So I have come to the end. I apologize for running long. Conclusions I want you guys to take away from this. VR audio is more than just head track spatialization over headphones. Physically based audio is great, but audio production is also an art, and I think some combination of ambisonics and object audio is what's really needed for great experiences with linear VR. To that end, egocentric single-point audio capture and delivery can be limiting, and creating compelling VR experiences requires realism, not reality. Finally, VR audio version 1 gets us very close to the streaming delivery of linear VR, but not quite. And this document could be seen as a feature request for Web Audio vNext. Thank you.